Hey everyone, welcome to week seven's chapter 11 of the Human Resource Management textbook. Today we're going to be talking about kind of uh, not the nicest issue. How about that? Or not the nicest topic about separating employees. This one's technically separating and retaining employees, but there's a definitely an emphasis on separating employees. So this one's not going to be too long, but I want to make sure we get to some of the strategies and some of the laws that are required for separating employees. So either voluntary or involuntary termination. So let's go ahead and just jump right into this. So, first of all, let's understand there's two types of turnovers. There's voluntary turnover and there's involuntary turnover. Voluntary turnover means an employee has initiated the leaving. The employee has said, I no longer want to be here, and they quit. So that's basically a voluntary quit. On the other hand, involuntary turnover can happen in a multitude of manners. So it could be dismissal due for cause, it could be a layoff, it could be a forced early retirement, it could be any number of things, right? And so the voluntary turnover is basically the employee is said, I no longer want to be here. I'm going to pursue opportunities elsewhere. For an involuntary turnover, employees initiate the employer initiates the termination and decides when, where, and how the employee is leaving. One of the things I love to see in companies, a lot of times they'll post statistics on voluntary turnover. And so, what percentage of employees leave of their own free will? And so, one of my favorites, up until recent times, up until probably last year, Southwest Airlines had one of the lowest voluntary turnovers, like 4%. 4% in the airline industry is huge. So Southwest Airlines was keeping its people, right? Plus, they didn't have a lot of involuntary turnover. They almost never had any layoffs. So rarely did people ever want to leave Southwest. Patagonia is another great example. Patagonia has literally almost zero voluntary turnover issues. So nobody wants to leave there. Once they get into Patagonia, they pretty much stay there. And so these are the two types of turnover issues that employers have to deal with, either somebody quitting or somebody being terminated. Uh, HR practices for separation and retention. So managing involuntary turnover is for HR, that's kind of their big thing. There's a lot of policies that go into this. There has to be a fair, legally defensible reason for terminating somebody. You have to provide management training on how to do that and post-employee benefits. And then you have to create equitable layoff procedures. Minimizing voluntary turnover, that's so managing involuntary is how do we manage separating people? How do we manage firing or laying off or whatever? How do we manage that? But then also, how do we minimize the voluntary turnover? How do we keep the people we want to keep? We want to promote employee engagement. We already talked about that multiple times. We want to prevent job withdrawal and we want to foster job satisfaction. In one of our last lectures, we talked about that. There was this chart about, you know, an engaged employee creates an engaged customer, creates, innovation, creates profits. So again, uh, ideally, what we want to do is we want to engage our employees. We want to grow them. We want to reward them. We want to acknowledge them in such a way that keeps them from wanting to leave. Again, that's what Southwest Airlines has done so well. The true cost of turnover. So for involuntary turnover, so people we are firing, we have to go out, we have to re-recruit, we have to select, we have to train replacements. We've got a loss of productivity. We've got, particularly if we fire, even for cause, potential lawsuits, and worst case scenario, there's potential workplace violence. And so you see it in the news often where somebody gets terminated from a position or they're just disgruntled, they come back and seek retribution. That is worst case scenario, but it's potentially possible. So the cost of turnover for voluntary turnover, again, we still have recruitment, selecting, training, replacement. We have still lost productivity. But in this case, instead of lawsuits and potential workplace violence, we have a loss of a talented employee and a subject matter expert and a potential loss of knowledge, right? That loss of knowledge is key. That loss of knowledge is key. So that's the true cost, right? And you can actually monetize that. Loss of knowledge, you can actually monetize that. Employment relationships today, what does it look like, right? Most companies in most states are at will employment, which means you can be fired or so as an employee, you can either be fired at will, right? We may end this relationship at any time unless specified in a contract. Both parties have the ability to leave whenever they want. At will employment states I can leave whenever I want as an employee, and a lot of times, uh, employers can terminate employment at any time, even sometimes without cause. It just depends on the state laws, and so that's something to think about. Most people, though, in most companies are working under an at-will doctrine. The other one is the psychological contract. Workers feel responsible for advancing their own careers, right? Loyalty towards employers is declining, right? So a lot of times now, as an employee, I feel like I got to take care of myself. I have to do what's right for me. And maybe it is leaving right now, right? Maybe it is leaving right now. And so, what that becomes for the employer, it makes it hard to retain talent. So, if the employee has taken it upon themselves to advance their own career and takes ownership of that, a lot of times you'll see if they're not given the opportunity for upward mobility, a lot of times they'll just leave. And so, again, that becomes very challenging for the employer. Principles of justice and separation. Really, there's a couple of different facets. Uh, Outcome fairness is really big. It's got to be so termination has got to be consistent. There's got to be consistent outcomes, knowledge of outcomes, outcomes in proportion to behaviors. So again, if someone's late one time, you don't fire them, right? You try to coach them up. Or if they're not performing at their job, if you haven't coached them, you can't just up and fire them. There has to be outcomes in proportion of the behavior. Procedural, that's outcome fairness. Procedural justice, consistent procedures, avoidance of bias, accurate information, ways to correct mistakes, representation of all interests, and ethical standards, right? So how we terminate somebody, how we separate somebody, there has to be a procedural justice component. And then interactional justice, explanation of decision, respectful treatment, consideration, and empathy. That's the one that a lot of companies lose sight of. They once they figure they're on their path to terminating somebody, they kind of treat them like dirt. That's the best way I can put it. There's no consideration, there's no respectful treatment, there's no empathy. A lot of times they just walk you out that day, walk you out. So the three steps that we need to look at here, the outcome fairness, employees judge consequences as just. Clear policies communicate expectations, and outcomes should be proportionate to behavior. And then the procedural justice, fair methods, right? Determine consequences, and then interactional justice. Managers need to interact even after an employee has been separated, still need to interact with dignity, with respect, and with empathy. Here's why. Think about if you're an employee who's currently staying at an organization. You're happy there, everything's great. You see one of your colleagues being terminated, even if it's for cause, and then you see them treated in a disrespectful, unempathetic, undignified manner. How does that make you feel as an employee who's decided to stay there? Does that give you a sense that, wow, if they treat that person like that, is there potential that they're going to treat me? Right? On the flip side, if you see somebody who's leaving, whether through voluntary or involuntary, and you see them being treated with respect, or you see them being treated fairly with empathy, probably going to make you think, okay, I made the right decision to stay here. Anytime I separated an employee, whether voluntary, involuntary, I never took it personally, never made it personal. I always tried to make sure that I treated people with respect, that I treated them with dignity, that I empathized with whatever they were dealing with, whether they were looking to leave on their own volition or they were being terminated. And so I think that went a long way with other employees. If I was having to lay off somebody, I literally cared for that individual. If they were leaving, I was like, hey, of their own volition, I'm like, hey, their door's always open if you're looking to come back or if things don't work out. And my employees who were still with me, just went so far with them. They loved that. And so think about these three principles for separation. Legal requirements, right? Wrongful discharge. So here's one area: cannot violate implied agreements, must honor promised job security, actions must align with company rules, and they cannot violate public policy, right? And so you have to be very careful legally when you wrongfully discharge somebody. Discrimination, right? Decisions made without regard to protected status. You always have to think about that when you're separating somebody. Are they part of a protected class? Careful documentation prevents claims, right? It can't just be this person upset you one time and then you fire them. We'd love to be able to do that, right? That would be easy. No, you have to first verbal warning, written warning, performance improvement plan, uh, a meeting, and then at a certain point you can then decide to either terminate, but hopefully they get better, right? Hopefully whatever the reason for you wanting to discharge them, maybe they've come around. And so that's why this process is there. You don't just fire people because they make a mistake, right? Because you don't know. They could be, you don't know what's going on in their life. Something could be happening. And so the reason we have these processes is to cover all of our bases legally, one, but to see if there's still hope to get this person back in line, right? Maybe it was just a one-off. And so again, we have a verbal warning, we have written warnings, we have performance improvement plans, we meet with them, and then if we still are in a place where we need to discharge, then we can discharge. But again, we have to be very careful, right? Employee privacy. We cannot let everybody know. Information about that termination or about that leave needs to be kept confidential. I just can't emphasize that enough. And then notification of layoffs. The WARN Act requires notice before closing or layoffs for economic reasons. So you can't just go, okay, everybody's laid off. The door's locked, don't show up. That happens, folks, and that is illegal. And so you can't just lay off people or shut down an organization without some sort of notice. It just doesn't, it's not legal. So we'll leave it at that. So those are kind of the legal requirements for separation. Um, here's so what I was talking about here in terms of PIP and warnings. So there's kind of two mindsets when it comes to discipline approaches. There's what we call the hot stove rule. It's a discipline that should provide a warning, be immediate, consistent, and objective, like touching a hot stove, right? And so if somebody does something wrong, you immediately jump in. You make sure they understand it's why it was wrong. They need to understand that immediately. You need to be consistent with how you deliver that. And then you also need to let them know kind of what the consequences are. Again, a kid touches a hot stove, they know immediately it's wrong. They know immediately the consequences. And so it's important but on this one, it's important to be consistent with that. Okay. And then there's progressive discipline. Formal process, right? It starts with an unofficial spoken warning. Hey, Joe, you can't be late anymore. Sorry, I'm picking on Joe. Joe, you can't be late anymore. This is your third time. You're slowing down our processes. It's really affecting not just employee morale, but it's also affecting our customer service. And so we need to get you in line. So there's my unofficial spoken warning. The next time Joe shows up late, I've got an official written warning, right? And then the next time he shows up late, it is a performance improvement plan. What are we going to do? How are we going to get you on track with a second written warning? Right? And then potentially the next one is even a temporary suspension plus a third written notice. That is, this is the last chance to improve. And then after that, you have a termination. Some of the times you would use this would be, again, tardiness or absenteeism, unsafe work practices, quality of work, sexual harassment. Even then, we have to do an unspoken, we have to do an official write up, we have to do a performance plan, second writing, and then a temporary potential temporary suspension until termination, right? Working while impaired, or even theft or cyber hacking. So these are some of the ways or some of the reasons you might use progressive discipline. Alternative dispute resolution, right? This is more about mediation, right? This is peer review. So, first of all, open door policy. Managers need to be able to be available to hear complaints, right? And in order to for anything, if an employee's got an issue with another employee, right? Ideally, you want to get those two employees together, but you have to have an open door policy because everything in this situation depends on the employee trusting the manager, right? So they have to have this open door policy when they have disputes with other colleagues. Peer review, right? It's a panel of organizational peers that listen and help parties reach settlements in a dispute. Mediations are non-binding. You get a third party to come in, and it's a neutral person. They come in and they basically mediate the whatever that dispute is between the two parties. And then arbitration is binding. The difference between mediation and arbitration: mediation is non-binding, arbitration is binding, where the professional arbitrator makes the decision whether the person is terminated or not, and the company has to live with it. And if they are terminated, the employee has to live with it. Support programs for transitions. I love these. I was part of an organization that we were brought in by companies to help support employees who were being laid off. So a lot of times we do resume referral or resume writing services, LinkedIn services, kind of career coaching like I do for our students. It's basically a referral service for professional treatment. There's also mental health, particularly when it comes to layoffs. So mental health issues, those could result in substance abuse. So a lot of companies will bring in these employee assistance programs, and help people deal with kind of the mental health issues of potential termination or layoff. And then this is where I came in. This is the outplacement counting. I'm sorry, help outplacement counseling. And this we help discharge employees transition to new jobs. Basically, we were out there working with other employees and employers, and we were working with these laid off employees to help them find new jobs. And we charged a fee for to the company, not to the employee. We charged a fee to the company to help them because it benefits them. Because if they lay somebody off, typically they're going to have to pay unemployment. And so the employer is responsible for paying that unemployment fee to the employee a lot of times. And so the sooner we can get that person back to work, the better it is really for everybody, for everybody. Employee engagement and job withdrawal. So this is the biggest challenge HR has. You know, the competitive advantage of engaged employees, we already talked about that, is higher productivity, better customer service, low turnover rate, right? So, uh, it really is important that, again, when we think of job satisfaction, we think of the outcomes of that. An employee who's engaged, the outcomes are far superior to a disengaged employee, right? So if we think about personnel dispositions or tasks and roles or supervising coworkers, pay and benefits, if there's any dissatisfaction with any of these, if you've got issues with your peers, if you've got issues with the work that you do, if you're not engaged with your work, if you've got issues with your managers, if you're not being paid what you think is fair pay, a lot of times that results in job dissatisfaction. Job dissatisfaction results in withdrawal, behavior change, physical job withdrawal, psychological job withdrawal, and then that leads to poor customer service, lower quality, and higher turnover. Building job satisfaction. Here are kind of the four key points to that. Uh, right. again, think about a place that you work or have worked where you're just like, I just I wake up in the morning ready to go to work, right? It's this pleasant feeling from perceiving that my job fulfills an important value. University of Massachusetts did a study at Mass General Hospital, and they interviewed the janitorial staff at the hospital, and they would go to the janitorial staff and they'd say, "Hey, tell me about your job. You know, what do you do?" And literally, the people would say, some of the janitorial staff would say, "Well, I save lives," and they say, "Oh, really? Speak to that." And they'd say, "Well, I make sure the rooms are clean. I make sure the operating room's clean. I make sure, there's no bacteria, no. So in me doing my job, I'm saving lives." And then they'd interview other janitorial staff and they would say, "I cleaned the toilets." And that was that. The people that you could see the difference in the level of work that the people who felt that they had a value added to that hospital by being being in the janitorial staff, their level of job satisfaction was through the roof, as opposed to somebody who just said, "Well, I just clean toilets." Um, and their work, you could see the results in their work, right? And so ideally what we want to do, it all starts with hiring, right? Hiring people who are typically predisposed to being satisfied, right? We do that in the interview. We think about that in the interview. So first and foremost, we hire people who are bought into our mission. Second, we design complex, meaningful jobs, right? And give people established, clear approaches and appropriate roles, right? So we give the right person, we hire the right person, give them the right job, right? And then we reinforce shared values, right? Again, I love Dr. Perry Brown over at Scripps Green. He's like, nobody, I'm not, as the CEO, he's the CEO of Scripps Green. He's like, I'm not as important, or I'm just as important as the ER nurse. I'm just as important, or that ER nurse is just as important as I am. The janitor people, we're all one team, right? We have shared values to care for people. And so as a leader, he never puts himself above anybody. And so again, when we think about hiring the right people, getting them in the right roles, reinforcing this shared value, and then satisfying pay levels, right? We need to pay people what they're worth and what the job entails, and so pay people right, right? And so, we need to think about four other key points. Personnel dispositions, right? Keep failures in perspective. Commit to work purposes. I used to have a boss who used to tell me, "You're never as good as your best and you're never as bad as your worst," right? Keep that in perspective. If you fail, you're going to succeed, right? You're going to come back and succeed. Tasks and roles. People want to do complex work. People want to do complex work. Again, we want to master. So, again, how do we create job satisfaction? Hire good people, right? Give them opportunities to fail and succeed. Make sure that they're doing complex, meaningful work, right? Make sure the people that are supervising them are care, they have empathy, right? Again, it's not people, I'm not in charge of anybody. I have people in my charge, which means I need to care for them. And then we give them good pay and good benefits, right? That's how we build job satisfaction over a long period of time, which keeps that voluntary turnover to a minimum. This is what, look at Southwest Airlines pre 2023. Look at Southwest Airlines pre 2023. That's them. Look at Patagonia. Look at Whole Foods. Any one of these companies you see, they do this to perfection.